A very good day to you and welcome to maimu, yetatokon, which means listen to our voices in the Patamona language. My name is Graham Atkinson. I am a project officer, project coordinator with the Indigenous Peoples Association, and we welcome you to this, our third live stream event in celebration of Indigenous Heritage Month 2020. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's live stream, and I must let you know that today we'll be tackling some of the more hardcore topics that affect us and how we view things and how we can suggest ways forward as well regarding some of the issues like the American Act revision, like who we call ourselves, like land title, land issues, land tenure, and so on. So we hope that over the next hour or so that you can be educated and that you can also participate on our Facebook page by posting your comments or your questions. And I'm sure our panelists will be able to answer them quite efficiently as well. So today I'm joined by 4 participants, and I would like to introduce them to you. And of course, they're all within our organization, having various roles and responsibilities. But let's get to hear where they're from, which nation they represent, and a little bit about them. I'll start off with our executive director, who is Jean LaRose. Jean, your microphone needs to be on.
Sorry, a bit of technical short-sighting, but my name is Jean LaRose, as Graham said, and I am of the Lakota people. I am from Santa Rosa Village in Region 1, and I have close to 30 years experience of working on the Indigenous rights issues and working with the Indigenous Peoples Association. So that's a bit of my background.
Thank you very much, Jean. We're still at Region 1, and we have Jean Sharon Atkinson.
Good day. I'm Jean Sharon Atkinson. I'm from Santa Rosa Village of the Lakota Nation. I'm a co-founder of the Indigenous Peoples Association. So I've been with the APA before it was formally established. And the reason why the organization was formed was because of some of the same issues we're going to address today. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And we'll jump from Region 1 right up to Region 7 and the Upper Mazruli and meet Laura George. Laura.
Good afternoon. So I am Laura Kapongura. I am Kapong from PBDY. That's up in the Kukui River. So we are the Kuwigok of the Kukui River. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Laura. We'll stay with you for now and begin with you actually to talk about Indigenous peoples and formal education. Very topical at the moment, given the COVID-19 pandemic and what we know happened with the schools closing countrywide, but also now with the new dispensation by the new government in place. How is that affecting our people or will affect our people? Talk to us a little bit about us, Indigenous peoples, and the whole formal education setup at the moment right now in Guyana.
All right, thank you, Graham. So we are aware, because we live in Georgetown, and for the few persons or communities that can access online news, there are teachers from the hinterland who are aware of an appointment or a virtual call to have a meeting organized by the Honorable Minister of Education, Priya Manikchand, recently. Unfortunately, a lot of teachers could not join in. I am aware of this because they were the teachers I was trying to assist in getting to join the Zoom meeting. For a consultation, it was said, especially with the grades 5 and 6 teachers on the way forward. However, we were hoping, me along with the teachers, I would say, we were hoping that there would be another consultation geared to have the teachers of the hinterland consulted with. That did not happen, but there has been a decision made to start schools virtually. There are supposed to be parallel activities according to the media, that media reports that some teachers will be receiving online training, that children from the hinterland or children who do not have access to internet or radio or television will be sent printed copies or hard copies. So while it might be an effort, I believe the lack of consultation with teachers in the hinterland, in indigenous communities, would have really affected how we move forward to ensure that indigenous children in the communities are engaged, are on par with the same level of access to education, a right that they all have under our laws. So at the moment, a lot of our children will be at a disadvantage or for a disadvantage. Again, with number one, if hard copies are sent to families, how does a parent be fully prepared, or if a parent that doesn't have the capacity to teach several different age children with different curriculum content from the different classroom stages, how might a parent be successful in doing that effectively with their own children? In addition to that, indigenous families, I know because I come from our own homes, indigenous families, parents who are largely live on subsistence farming, will find it difficult to stay at home on the number of days or the time required to have their children or to support their children go through whatever hard copies they're sent. It leaves vague as well towards the end result. How do we grade our children, indigenous children, after, with these several experiences and challenges? Now, besides that, how are teachers fully equipped if there is still to be training going online for children? That means our teachers also are left with not on-par training for teachers who have access to online training that might be going on to do this. Because a lot of our teachers, we know generally, regardless of whether they're in the hinterland or out in the coast, teachers, even teachers who have access to mobile apps or any other internet tools and devices, it's always been a challenge training or doing the teaching virtually. It's a challenge trying to teach on a Zoom session like this, for example. Because largely Guyana has lacked a focused, continuous teacher support enablement to teach or to maximize or to utilize different methods of teaching. COVID has come, and again, it has brought to the fore that there is still a large gap in getting our children the right to access for equal and equitable education as there are for children who do not live in the hinterland communities. So I can only imagine what's happening out there. When we go through social media comments on Facebook by teachers who do not have laptops, by teachers who find it challenging to pay internet fees, because how much then is the government prepared to make sure that the teachers have access to internet services? So then we cannot over talk about how much of a disadvantage it is putting towards our teachers and to our children. And it's almost discriminatory if we want to feel that out here from our offices or as a ministry, we go ahead to start regardless of whether children are, and teachers and parents are prepared or not. The budget debate are still ongoing. What should have happened is wait to see what monies there are available and to have a consultation to see how best we maximize financial and other resources to make sure that all children, regardless of whether they live in the hinterland or not, have access to proper education within the circumstances, that in the end, our children also meet the requirements of what is formal performances. That is what I would say to this point.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I would like to ask if Jean or Sharon has any supporting comments here.
Well, I'm aware, even in Georgetown here, where Indigenous students have been affected by this as well. Having been dependent on the university, actually going to classes and so, and some may not understand the difficulty even for these students to get a laptop, a tablet, have access to ready internet at home. And therefore, how much a difficult situation have these students been put into? And I'd also like to refer to the point that Laura made in terms of parents now becoming teachers, parents who are required to do that by virtue of the fact that they have their children at home. A school education learning process has started and they're given books. But these may be parents who do not have the slightest clue how to teach their children. How do we end up grading these children in comparison to those who have access to internet, in comparison to those who have access to books, in comparison to those who may have parents who have a tertiary education and may be able to cope with teaching their children? You know, that is something that needs to be examined and need to be taken into account. I know COVID, no government plan for COVID, but we have to now plan for the effects of COVID, and how do we address this with the communities? I think this is very important, and this is something that the government has to speedily address, especially in terms of the communication gap.
Sharon, do you have a view?
Yes, I would just like to add that it's difficult even for children, Indigenous children in Georgetown. If you have a child going to the university, if you have a child going to GSA, if you have a child going to a secondary school, it means you have to, everybody would have to get their own computer. You have to get adequate internet service because the amount of megabytes coming off of it would be used up by all these computers. You have to have different rooms in your home. So in the Indigenous communities, if you're finding it that difficult in the city, the Indigenous communities, they are at a more disadvantage, even if they're going to use radios for a classroom, for classroom purposes. It means if you have children in the nursery section, or if you have them in different forms in the primary classroom, if you have some in the secondary classroom, it means that you have to have more than one equipment, whether it's radio, whether it's computers, or whatever. It means you have to have more than one equipment. So it's for this point in time, I have not seen any tangible program publicly where this has been adjusted to really meet the needs of the Indigenous children in communities, and it's really worrying. It means that our people in the communities there would be a gap in catching up to the national curriculum.
I want to ask this rather, thank you very much, ladies, for your comments on this first topic. But I want to ask you generally, who is really responsible for the internet, the connectivity for Indigenous communities? I know Laura might have mentioned a few points, we are seeing a sort of a top-down approach at the moment with the current government. Who is responsible, really, ultimately?
There is a project, the Hinterland, the ICT Hub project, it's funded by out of the agreement with Norway. So there's also a project board to who have the oversight about where these happen. But what has happened is there are several villages, for example, in the Upper Mazruni that were not listed under the project. I know that in Region 9, for example, there are several villages who are fortunate to be listed under the project. Again, when it comes to how did these selections go, I mean, you are correct in asking who make the decisions, or has it been a top-down approach? It might very well be that is what has happened. So we do not have an equitable spread of ICT hubs throughout Guyana in the hinterland villages. But what we can have, though, is hopefully out of the budget approval and the passage of the budget, is to have increased bandwidth, but also the establishment of additional ICT hubs in the villages, in more villages. Probably more radio stations in the regions. The Upper Mazruni, for example, they have no access to any radio station, except I think the BBC News or the Venezuelan radio or the Brazil radio. That's where we got the news from. So those services need a lot of improvement, and quickly a quick improvement in services and number of services. That's what we need to have at minimum.
Thank you, Laura. Is there any other view, Jean or Sharon?
I think we could go on and on about this. I guess maybe for another occasion. Huh?
All right. So you're listening to, or you're looking at and viewing, I'm sure persons might be pulling this audio as well, to Ina Maimu yetatokon, which is Patamona for Listen to Our Voices, a production of the Indigenous Peoples Association. Indigenous Peoples and Land Tenure. Since the time of independence, a prerequisite for independence, championed by Stephen Campbell, first parliamentarian, that has been on the table even long before that. What has been our experience in Guyana regarding this? I'll start with Jean, and then we go to Sharon.
Okay, so I want we won't go in depth in this because this can take the rest of the year, in fact, to talk about Indigenous land right issues. But just to say that, before independence, we were hustled into settlements for reservations, basically for Indigenous peoples. Part of it is because we were not seen as being able to govern, to regulate ourselves. And therefore, we had a protector of Indians and people like that who were put there to look after our interests. Then we had independence, and then we had our own constitutions that seek to preserve and protect the rights of Guyanese citizens as a whole. And of course, we were expecting that this would also take into account the rights of the Indigenous peoples. We had the Amendment Act then being revised in 2006. Prior to that, it was a document of the colonial government as well. And there was a revision in 76 and other revisions thereabouts. But none of these really addressed the question of Indigenous land tenure, Indigenous rights. And currently, even to date, as we talk about the Amendment Act, that is one of the areas that the Indigenous Peoples Association has been pushing for over the years in terms of really adequately addressing Indigenous people's rights to land. We have heard in the past, and sometimes people say, why are these people asking for land? They have a whole area of land there that covers a river and a mountain and so forth. But if you understand Indigenous people's way of life, if you understand the importance the meaning of the geography, the land, the mountains, the rivers, to communities, the dependence on the water for I don't even want to use the word potable, but for having the rivers, for having water, the dependence on the forest for hunting and fishing and gathering and making your huts, and there's so many things. If you are to take half hour, an hour, talk with somebody to understand what really is the importance of land to Indigenous people, you would understand why it is that we are seeking legislation that protect us, why we are seeking enhanced legislation that protect us, why we are seeking policy that also protect us. But like I said, we can talk about this going into the end of the year. And I know that Laura and Sharon also want to talk about this. Laura specifically in relation to the Amerindian, and Sharon has a wide experience in terms of actual working on the ground in several areas, dealing with land rights issues. So I'll not take up more of the time and give it to the two of them.
Thank you, Jean. So I guess we'll go to Sharon to give us her experience as a woman, Indigenous woman, working with the land tenure assessments that APA did in the past, and maybe to give us some examples of what she found from the eyes and perspective of a woman on the ground. Sharon.
For me, it was a very interesting program, doing research in regions 1, 2, 7, and 8. And as a woman and meeting other females on the ground, it was, and males as well, the knowledge holders about the lands, our customary practices, other traditional activities. It was really all connected to the land. And sometimes people say, especially people who do not understand our way of living and our concept of land, people say, like, you know, why do these people want more lands? Are they greedy for lands? Sometimes we even call greedy. However, we have been able to live from generation to generation on our lands because, one, we live in harmony with the lands. We get our food, we gather, we hunt, we fish, we build, we barn, we die all on the lands, and not just in a little space. The first time, and I'm sorry, but I have to say this, the first time the legislations that were created for reservations was in 1902. And just before independence, 1902, and just before independence, we had the Lands Commission report, where Mr. Stephen Campbell was very active. And I must say, he wasn't just a lone figure, although we may project the image of Stephen Campbell, which is good in itself, but he had a lot of support from the two shows in Region 7, 8, 9, 1, and 2. And during that time, the two shows, the Akwayo and Arikuna two shows from Region 7, met in Santa Rosa Village with two shows of Regions 1 and 2 in 19, just prior to independence, on the 7th of October. And they, again, spoke with Mr. Campbell, and they authorized him. Actually, they saw him as this eloquent vocal person that could have really represented the issue of the land, which is attached to our way of life. And from then, from 69 to 2020, where are we in these decades of struggle for recognition of our land rights? In 76, it was the first time communities received titles, and those had conditions attached. One, and I'd like to point this one out, was basically if we were unaffected towards the state, then our lands could have been taken away from us. The Lands Commission report specifically said that we were not sophisticated enough have the lands that our ancestors were claiming. We couldn't manage it. We hadn't the managerial skills. In 1991, the Hoyt administration granted another set of titles, but this time under the State Lands Act, but for the same parcels of land. So there wasn't any, the only improvement there was that the legislation stated it didn't have those conditions about being disloyal or disaffected toward the state, but we do not own the diamond and the gold, the subterranean water, and the minerals and so on, which was some sort of improvement on the land, but the same parcels of land remain. So in 1991, 10 additional communities were granted land titles. However, because the state does not recognize our rights to something as basic as water, where we fish, where we cook, where we bathe from, and we do everything literally from. We've had numerous violations I found, especially in mining communities or where there is a lot of trade going on, where spawning grounds for the fishes are polluted. And I found this especially up in the Baramita area. The head of the creeks were being polluted. I've seen this in parts of Region 8. More communities, more areas in Region 1. And they have been also, and I'd like to focus on Chinese landing, for example, where part of the community title was put up for lottery. And there is an ongoing problem with that situation to date. We've also seen where miners are constantly not respecting the community traditional rules, or even those that the few things that are captured in the Amering Act, the few articles that are captured in the Amering Act. We've also seen customary lands, traditional lands being handed out to forestry concessions. We've seen demarcation problems, demarcation flaws, where there are overlaps into communities, where churches, schools, homesteads are, it's not titled, but the other part, the other section of the land is given title to. So while some amount of land titling has been done, there are many things there yet to be corrected, many things to be done on the ground. We've seen where there weren't feedbacks on investigations. We've seen where there weren't feedbacks before the titles were granted. If the communities were okay with this cadastral survey, or they were okay with the whole process of demarcation of their of titling. So that is some of the things we came up with. And then I met a lot of women on my travels, and to those who may see me now, I thank you very much for being my guide during those times, for sharing your knowledge about the lands, your legends, your stories. And our lands has a lot of stories to it as well. For example, I can tell you about the Moruca area. People have this notion, many of my people in Santa Rosa say we're Spanish Arawaks, and some very, I would say, prominent Guyanese, even lawyers think we came to Santa Rosa village and settled there after the Venezuelan revolution, but that is not so. There is history, and some of our sites have been scientifically tested, and we've been here at least 6,500 years BP. So the myth that people came and settled us, or we were, or after independence, we somehow became a nation, that is not true. We had our own systems of governance, our own systems of our security of tenure of our lands as well.
Thank you, Sharon. Laura, with laws and legislations and policies across the spectrum, and particularly regarding land tenure, there seems to be a clear misunderstanding of how Indigenous people view land tenure, ownership of land, or the whole concept of land, and what the laws of the country have. And there is this seemingly endless clash of Greco-Roman laws that talks about ownership of land, which is entirely in conflict with the Indigenous people's concept of their land ownership. How do we reconcile that particular situation? And is it true that the policies and legislation lack that basic understanding of how we view land?
Okay, thank you, Graham. And I really would like to say that how proud I was with, Sharon articulating the sequence and what happened with all of our land rights struggle and all of that. So when it comes to understanding and respecting Indigenous peoples' land rights and the land tenure situation, and working towards ensuring that our rights are protected, it takes political will, individual legislators and the political administrations, for them to understand and want to learn to respect what land rights and land tenure means to Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples, this is why we say Indigenous peoples, have lived according to how we occupy our territory. That's what it was. Sharon spoke earlier to how, sometimes in Maruka, we embrace, or people have made you embrace that you are Spanish Arawaks. What happened before the formal demarcation of the country's boundaries? We lived as one people all around, well, within our territories. And our territories spanned or went beyond what today are formal boundaries. And so this is why we have, for example, in Region 6, we have people, Indigenous peoples that live, they have their family, but we're now separated by boundary between Guyana and Suriname. A boundary with, like us with Venezuela and Brazil. That's happening in Region 9 with Brazil. It happens in Region 1 with Venezuela and all of these things. Legislations that were developed afterwards, I would say more recent, have fragmented Indigenous peoples into what are small village titles, land titles. The village land titling under the Amerindian Act have not created or catered to protect and recognize territorial occupation and use and rights of Indigenous peoples. What it has done is fragmented us into individual villages within territories, even though we might be one people. So for example, in the Upper Mazruni in Region 7, we are Akawayo. There is one Arikuna village, but as the Kapong, there are 6 villages that are divided, and between those areas are lands that we collectively recognize and use as our lands. We use it for hunting, fishing, farming, gathering whatever resources and everything else. Our sacred sites, it belonged to us, the Kapong. We share lands with the Arikuna or the Pemon. And likewise, it's like that in Region 8, the Patamonas and the Makushi. In Region 9, the Wapichan and the Makushi, and you have the YY. In Region 2, you have the Lokono and some Carib. Even Region 2 being separated is really the land of what today is the Carib, the Kalitna, right? The Kalitna, the Lokono, and the Warao. Yes, I know the Akawayos were there too. But my point in saying this, the current Amerindian Act does not protect, it does not guarantee territorial recognition and rights of Indigenous peoples. And so the challenges have been in between those fragmented villages are lands that we still use and occupy up to are lands that we recognize as ours, even though state legislation does not give that protection. So now we have other concessions or other party interests being given paper to these lands. And that have been creating challenges, that have been creating rights violations for Indigenous peoples throughout Guyana. Sharon gave an example of Chinese landing. In the Upper Mazruni, where I come from, our people took the government to court. It's gonna be 22 years waiting for a court decision to recognize and declare these are the lands of the Kapong and the Pemong nations up there. Our courts have not been pushing to make sure that this is guaranteed or this is done through the courts to fulfill what the Constitution provides for us as Indigenous peoples. Under the Constitution of Guyana, it speaks clearly to Indigenous peoples. And so this is why a revision of the relevant legislation for Amerindian Act, that's called, needs to be revised and done quickly. Guyana is host for mass investment in infrastructural development throughout the hinterland. Only this morning, we listened to the joint press conference between President Irfan Ali and the Secretary of State of the United States, Secretary Pompeo, talking about signing agreement to investment. This is for private sector of the US to support the private sector of Guyana to ensure that we have development and benefits for our citizens, they say. But we also know of the mass environmental destruction that comes with the so-called development that takes place in countries. We've seen it in other countries before, so we can only imagine what's going to happen. Legislation, for example, mining laws that do not recognize or protect Indigenous people's rights to land, to their resources, to waterways. It doesn't protect us in giving us the right to say yes or no to what happens on our lands. And I'm speaking beyond titled lands. What happens, it doesn't give us the right, it doesn't protect our right to say yes or no, because the mining rights, the Mining Act, even the Amerindian Act that says our rights are conditioned or under condition to the miners under the Mining Act. It doesn't say that if we say no, it cannot be mining. It doesn't happen like that. So all of these things need to change. Legislation needs to be revised to give us the right to say yes or no, in as much as we, the leaders and community members throughout many villages that I know throughout the regions, have been able to say yes or no. Other laws have been used to try to override those positions. So for example, in the case of Kako, I recall the Tushao of Kako, his Tibakas Tushao today, was almost taken to court, was almost imprisoned for daring to prevent mining from happening in their lands and on their waters. Mind you, again, he was reminded by the Minister of Natural Resources, the then Minister of Natural Resources. He was reminded by the Minister of Amerindian Affairs, who's back today. He was reminded by he was pressured and by all of them, including the GGMC officer, my commissioner, that this was not our land. It was not their land, but this was outside of their title land. Legislation that says we do not have rights to waterways, so we cannot stop anyone from passing through those waters or rivers, even if it goes through our title lands. We cannot do that. Again, coming back to under COVID-19, it's an additional challenge because villages that are saying no to mining or from mining by outsiders are given the challenge that they don't have the right to stop these people from passing through the waters that run through the lands freely. The waters are our parts of our lands, right? So any revision of the Amerindian Act to be done has to also take into consideration for the coordination and for the amendments with other legislation to make sure that Indigenous people's rights are protected that the environment is protected, the waters are protected, because this is not just for Indigenous peoples. This is for us all in Guyana. We take our lands for granted. We take our greenery and our clean waters for granted. Guyana has been very vocal and leading the way in the fight against global warming and climate change, promoting that we have a lot of forests because of we refer quickly to, because of our forestry laws and regulations and the practices. But that's not only what it is. A major part of why Guyana has a lot of forests and our healthy greenery and our rivers is because Indigenous peoples who live on our lands have been the one protecting our lands. And we continue to fight for this to be protected. So when Indigenous peoples fight for lands, it is not because we are greedy, to repeat Jean and whatever that some politicians were saying before. It is protecting, number one, our right to say yes or no on what happens on our lands, the right to be consulted, the right to give our consent to what happens, and the right to a healthy environment, the right to rivers free of pollution and contamination, and the right to our future generations. When we speak to celebrating Heritage Month must not be seen only in the sense of dancing with the beads and the feathers and drinking the fly. We need a land for our cassava to grow, our potatoes to grow, and for our children. We need a land to have healthy forests, healthy lands, healthy soils, healthy waters, and the fish and the food that we depend on. And yes, if, for example, there might have to be any extraction of natural resources, it must be done in consultation with and the consent of Indigenous peoples, participating not only when the miner comes with a paper approval from the relevant agencies, but the right of Indigenous peoples, representatives sitting at a national level, discussion at a national level, at national level, to decide and to say and to participate how we go about in our nation building. The building of roads in nation building or development doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the best for Indigenous peoples. Give our peoples the right and to be included in discussions and decision making, respect the right to say yes or no, and have this mandated and written in legislation. And that is what is important. You know, Indigenous peoples are seen as,
if I may just quickly bring this concept in, and I'll ask Jean and Sharon to respond as well. Maybe Jean first, is that with the land tenure of our Indigenous people not being secure in Guyana, we consider it with surety at this time, it's not secure. There is a cycle of vulnerability and poverty. How would you respond to such a statement? That with lack of land tenure security, the cycle of vulnerability and poverty is going to continue in Indigenous communities. I'll go with Jean first.
Land is part of Indigenous people's culture throughout the world, not only in Guyana. It's part of our culture. It's as I introduced the topic, I said it's what you depend on for a number of things. I remember growing up as a child. It has changed now, but growing up as a child, we had so much more of the untouched forest that we could have played in. But it means at the same time too, it was untouched because it was providing food for us. The lava, the akuri, the deer, you name it. Those are the things that we could have gotten there from the land. The result of more homes, the result of more trees being cut down is you have the animal population dying out. The same thing can be said for the extractive sector. You have mining taking place, and sometimes a huge number of mining concessions in one area can end up looking like one large-scale mining operation. But the effect on the land, which sometimes the forest can never grow back in those areas, the effect on the land is sometimes irreparable. But it means also that you are destroying the resources of communities that are either nearby. Sometimes it's the community's land that are titled. Sometimes it's the traditional land untitled to the communities. And then you can have environmental pollution, water pollution, and so forth. So you know, there's so many reasons why it is important that lands are protected for indigenous peoples and communities.
Thank you, Jean. Sharon, do you have a perspective?
The you said vulnerability and poverty. I've never considered myself living in my village as being poverty stricken. I grew up without a dad, but with uncles and lots of relatives. And the village I come from in my time, we had lots and lots of fruits and vegetables and ground provision. And I walked from 1 mile to my primary school barefoot, and bare feet, and I never considered myself as poverty stricken. I thought, well, you know, that was the way I was happy and free and independent, like I still am today. But in terms of access to modern day information and technology, yes, there are some major gaps there. And the way our society is changing in Guyana, we have to carefully look at how our people, the vulnerability of our people in closing that gap there. And we also have to look at how do we adapt the adaptation. And there are several factors we have to consider. One is climate change, our system of farming. Again, we come back to the lands. If our mainlands are eventually go into large housing schemes or into large different agriculture for like soya beans, these major corporations take over our trad lands, that means we would not have access. Even sometimes these miners are forest concession holders. For my visits on the ground, people would have said they don't want even you to cut, they don't even want you to cut a wattle or a tree to make a canoe. You have to get permission from them, although the Forestry Commission denies and says there is a clause in the agreement for traditional use and stuff like that. On the ground, it is a whole different scenario. So there are still legislations that has to be enacted to protect the security of indigenous people's land tenure, because no matter how much university we go to, I'm talking about the formal universities, because those who have graduated from the university without walls would know that the lands are our, let's say it's our parent. That's where we gather and we get everything from. And if mining, if mercury pollution, if the forests are cut down, then the animals go, the birds go, of course, they come and they feed on your farms first, and then they go somewhere else wherever they can, and eventually they die as well. So there is this whole set of what must I say, this whole environmental thing that is connected to us as well, and which is connected to the animals, the birds, the bees, and everything. So how do we survive? How do we continue to adopt, taking into all these whole lack of security to tenure, the lack of official recognition to something as basic as water? I grew up thinking white sand was our own. Is only some time ago I learned that we supposed to get the permission from GGMC to use that, rocks. And that brings us to the question, exactly what legitimately we own when we say we own the lands. If we do not own the subterranean water, the waterways, we have no management rights or control over those waterways when people are passing through. And this came out even more so in recently in the COVID situation, when the village council rules were being, when the Tushos were trying to prevent people from going into the village or leaving the village, trying to protect their people from an unknown killer, this virus. their laws were being overridden sometimes by the police. Even the Ministry of Health laws did not take in some of this. The Amerindia Act, as far as I'm concerned, was bypassed. One legislation effectively closed down whatever access the village council had rights over access and entry. So
I think we're getting into that next topic now with legislation and the policy with regards to Indigenous people. So since you're on the floor with that, I guess we could start with you to talk about the Amerindian Act, the very health ordinance, the health orders or experience with COVID-19, and all the other laws that help to undermine access and entry into Indigenous communities and Indigenous people's lands. So let's talk about that from your, because I know you're getting into that and how that policy has shaped over the years.
Yeah, so I was a little while getting to that, but what I was going to say, our concept of the land is not just the bare land, it's everything. Waterways, creek, mountain, rivers, streams, ite trees, the bees, the birds, the akuri, we call them. Every single thing. When we say we own this piece of land, that's what we mean. We just don't mean the land literally. And when legislations are enacted, they should consider and respect those we have put in authority there to guard and protect and defend those lands and the inhabitants on those lands. So I'm sorry to plan getting there.
All right, Laura, you wanna?
So with regard to the Amerindia Act, I was pointing out earlier, Guyana is poised for massive, for mega investments. It's already here. It's been here a while. But with the increased, we talk about development and money coming from oil. It's really alarming though, because a lot of monies that be going towards hinterland infrastructural development, like the building of roads, highways, it requires the Guyana have strong mechanisms, a strong legal framework to ensure that the environment is protected, that the right of Guyanese to effectively participate in decision-making is also enforced. We know it hasn't been like this. The Environmental Protection Act and their capacity to actually ensure that the ESIAs, the environmental social impact assessments, are done properly, that time is given for oversight and input by the man in the street, by civil society organizations, by Indigenous peoples, organizations that are interested or that feel we need to have an input to make sure our rights are protected. All of those things need to be done in coordination. Many times the EIAs that have come out are rushed, and that has to change. And it has to be protected and provided for in legislation, that if adequate time is not given or that enough provision is not made for effective participation and input and inclusion in decision-making, then someone needs to be held accountable. That has to be provided for in law as well. And therefore, then I extend towards Indigenous people's rights. That needs to be cemented in a revised law to ensure that our rights are fully protected. All we are calling for is for our fundamental rights, at minimum, reflecting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that Guyana has endorsed. I think up to this point in the current emergency budget that is being debated, there is no mention of Amerindian Act revision as a priority. That needed to be a priority. However, maybe going forward, we're hoping, we will be asking for a meeting with the President of Guyana. We've asked for a meeting with the Minister of Amerindian Affairs, who is still to respond to give us a date. And we want to have these meetings to raise critical issues, priority issues for Indigenous peoples going forward. And that administration, together with the opposition, need to work in tangent with Indigenous peoples and other civil society organizations to ensure our rights are protected as Indigenous peoples and as Guyanese. So that's what we'll be pushing for to be done as priority. Under the coalition, I do know that we work to support the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs to get a revision process started. That is the consultations and all of that. So we are hoping that political administration will be mature to accept that there has work already started, and we don't need to go back to where, because our rights protection, full protection under the law is paramount and needs to be taken on board as urgent as well.
Thank you, Laura. You are looking at in a maimu yetatokon, which is Patamona for Listen to Our Voices. It's a presentation of the Amerindian Peoples Association. Who are we? How do we self-identify? How is this protected in international law and in the Constitution of Guyana? It is a very topical issue given the recent change of government and of course the changing of names of the Ministry of Indigenous Peoples Affairs to the Ministry of Amerindian Affairs. Jean, please take the first jump here.
All right. We're Indigenous peoples. You know, in the 2000s, when our constitution was being revised, I was part of the constitution reform process when it took place there. And I take no blame for it not being revised to take into account our current political scenario that we found ourselves in. But when the constitution was being revised, the question of Indigenous people came up, and it was addressed positively in the Constitution. Our preamble talks about Indigenous peoples. We have an Indigenous Peoples Commission, because when I sat on the commission, one of the things that I promoted largely was Indigenous peoples' rights across the board. Land rights, rights to being part of the decision-making process, right to entry and access, right to protection of the environment, and so forth. So I was part of those discussions, and therefore I was happy when the preamble took into account Indigenous peoples, when Article 149G of the Constitution refers to Indigenous peoples' rights and their rights to their way of life, their protection and promulgation of Indigenous peoples' way of life. I was also happy when there was an Indigenous Peoples Commission named, although it did not take into account the full range of recommendations that were made at that time. In fact, none of the recommendations received take into account the full range of recommendations that were made eventually. But I was happy when all of those were taken into account in the constitution reform process. If we look a few years after that process, we had a revision of the Amerindian Acts. And again, the Amerindian Peoples Association has been part of that whole process, advocating for pushing to seek not only legislative but policy reform to protect some of those very rights that Sharon and Laura and we have been talking here today. So in the reform of the Amerindian Act that was passed in 2006, of course, there was a process that took a few years before the act could finally be passed. And, you know, it was the process of constitutional reform. But even more so in the process of revision of the Amerindian Act, it was so much politicized that you had our Indigenous brothers and sisters who are pitted against each other, you know, for basically some saying we are not Indigenous, it's only plant is Indigenous, you know, that kind of thing, and we must maintain the name Amerindian. And then of course there were others who falling in line with norms as they have been developing over the years, not only among Indigenous people, but the world over, where people have been called certain names colonially. People have been described by the color of their skin, by the texture of their hair, by the way they speak, and they have been given names that are not necessarily the best for the people. But sometimes you come to accept it because, something is drilled into your head all the time. And then you say, maybe that's me. And maybe I should accept it. And that's how people know me. And that's how I'll hear it. And that's how I'll take it. Right? But we have developing norms. We have developing legislation and so many other things developing, including the way we address each other and the way we address people. And I don't need to point out to you how this has developed for other ethnicities. And therefore, for the indigenous peoples, you had debates on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples taking place for over 20 years before it was finally passed in 2007, just after the revision of the Amerindian Act was passed. So in 2000, in early 2000s, you had the revision of the Amerindian Act, the revision of the Constitution, use indigenous peoples. Then we go to 2006, where you have the Amerindian Act is revised. You have where there was a lot of, I stood up in front of the Parliament building, trying to get an ear because we were blocked off from, in fact, going into the Parliament buildings when there were hearings in some cases. But then you have that period where Amerindian then was kept within the Amerindian Act. 2007, when the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples were passed, you hear the term that I'm using there. It was a term that had been debated over and over again, only sometimes for the point of definition as to who is indigenous peoples, and that was passed, and Guyana acceded to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Come 2020, well, before 2020, we had a Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, we had a Minister of Indigenous Affairs, and I think we felt fairly comfortable that, look, we fall into a norm to accepting a description that we more accept, that is better for us. And then now we're going back to a debate of what do we call ourselves? What I am seeing is some people who willingly refer to themselves as indigenous people are now calling themselves back Amerindian again. Particularly because it's a safe position to take when it comes to affiliation to a political party. I've seen some people describe it as Amerindian/indigenous people. Make up your mind. What is it do you want to be called? Like I said, there are names that have been given to us, and there are names that are self-identified, right? And that's the difference that I'm talking about. I started talking earlier about the colonial times when we were put on reservations, when we were seen as not being able to govern ourselves, and we were given a name. Do we want to continue with that name? Are we going to continue for the name to be politicized? Right? Do we have pride in ourselves? What is it that we are holding on to a relic of colonialism as well? Right? And people may say, okay, but and here we are talking about the Amerindian Peoples Association. Yes, we were given that name. We accepted that name when we ourselves felt it was okay, but times have changed, and we understand the concept and the context within which it fell at that time. Now we are moving to change the name of the organization, right? So for me, it should not be treated as a political football. Right now, you have debates taking place in the National Assembly, and the way indigenous peoples and the way Amerindians are being treated, it's like a rallying call. Hey, I'm Amerindian because I belong to this group. Hey, I'm indigenous people, because it should not be made that way. And we ourselves as indigenous people should look into ourselves and say, what does a name carry for us? I would refer to myself as Lokono. I'm Lokono, of the Lokono nation, Lokono meaning people. And that's how indigenous people in Guyana generally describe themselves as the people of the land, the people of something, but we are the people. And there are reasons behind why it's important for this term to be recognized as well. Like I said, it's a term that has also been used in international law. Again, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So, you know, for me, it's a case of, do we move back? Do we move forward? Do we allow ourselves to be pulled in a direction that, you know, or are we happy to be pulled in a direction that may not necessarily be the best for our children going ahead, for our grandchildren going ahead, for my nieces, for my nephew? What, when you talk about Indigenous people and Indigenous pride, what are you talking about? How do we see that included in our in our social studies book? Do we continue to be referred to as, oh, the Amerindians and the Amerindian language? You know, or are we a people, collectively an Indigenous people, or individually Lokono, or Kapong, or Pimong, or you name it, right? So I think it's also a matter of respect for us as a people, and respect within ourselves for us as an individual as well. And I urge our people who have been using the term as a football, pitching it here and pitching it there, just examine more, have some conversations. I'm not putting anybody down, right? But I'm saying, have conversations on a name, examine the origins, examine why it is that this name may be better than the other one. Of course, if you continue and you wish to continue to be called that name, no one can take that away from you. It's your right. But, you know, like I said, people have evolved. The naming of people have evolved. This is not only with Indigenous peoples. This is with other peoples around the world, and more suitable, more apt, more applicable descriptions have been decided upon by the people themselves as to what they would want to be called. Right? So that's my take on the Indigenous part there.
Thank you, Jean, and our panelists, Jean, Sharon Atkinson, Jean LaRose, and Laura George. Our time is almost up, but I'll give you all 1 minute each to close off your being present here today on our panel. In this, the APA production, Ina Maimu Yetatokon, which is Listen to Our Voices. And I promise you, we'll have more of these sessions live for you on Facebook, and maybe more interactive as well, to talk about the identification part, maybe as a session by itself, because all of these can be very many sessions for the rest of the year and next year as well. So I'll start with Laura, your closing remarks.
Thank you, Graham. So as you rightly said, the theme of our discussions have been maimu yetatokon. So that's how the Akawayo and Patamona, Kapong and Patamona are similar. And it's really saying, listen to our voices. And so that is what we're calling on, to have the respect to listen to us. Do we still want to, do you want to just apply a colonial term that was imposed on us? Or would you listen to us? Would you have respect enough to listen to us on our right to self-determination, on what we would like to be called, and how that we would like to have that cemented in legislation, to have our protections in law? We're asking you to listen to us. We have that right, to speak, and you have the obligation to listen to us. That is what I would like to say. And going forward, I look forward to more discussions and more times that, and I hope that a lot more will be able to tune in to listen to these sessions as well. Thank you for the time.
Sharon and Jean?
Well, I consider myself Indigenous. I am Indigenous. The Constitution of Guyana addresses people like me as Indigenous. 149G gives me the right to defend, protect, and promulgate my culture, my language, and my way of life. It also speaks about me in the preamble to the Constitution. We also, under that same Constitution of Guyana, it also caters for the establishment of an Indigenous Peoples Commission. In international law, we addresses Indigenous Peoples. And I am quite comfortable with the term Indigenous, and I'm not lobbying people to say, well, this one is right or this one is wrong. However, many of our terminologies and our laws can be dated back to 1902 Aboriginal Ordinance Protection under the colonial government. And I hope to see that these relics can be gotten rid of very soon, and we have our right to self-determination is respected. Thank you.
For me, I want to comment on a comment that I saw being made by one of the presenters in the National Assembly in relation to debating on a name or debating on eradication of poverty. My position would be, as most women are accustomed to, we can multitask. We can get the name right. We can work towards eradication of poverty. We can work towards getting our land rights issues being addressed. We can work towards ensuring that participation in the decision-making process is taken on board. We can work towards to ensure that our health facilities and all of that are up to scratch. We can work to ensure that our education facilities and systems are in place to the satisfaction of the indigenous peoples of this country. That's what a government is in place there for, to multitask, to ensure that all these different systems and all these different needs by communities are addressed. So we expect that the government will work in all of these areas and look at all of these issues, and we're ready to work with you. We're ready to make recommendations. I think we have good suggestions. I think we have good ideas. I think we have good recommendations, and we're willing to work with you in terms of securing this that I know indigenous peoples would want to for our country and for our peoples.
Thank you, ladies. So before we go, reminding you that the APA's video competition, the deadline is on the 25th of September 2020. And this evening at 7 p.m. or 19 hours, we will be premiering one of our videos for you, a program that we have at the APA Youth-Led Media Program. We will be premiering one of their videos. So be sure to join us on our Facebook page for 19 hours or 7 p.m. this evening for that premiere. And once again, thank you for joining us. It has been a production of the APA in maimu, yetatokon. Listen to our voices. Do join us next Friday for another edition of this program. Have a great day and a great weekend.
Thank you.